The UN's top court, meanwhile, is set to rule on Israel's legal obligation to ensure desperately needed humanitarian aid gets to Palestinians in Gaza and the occupied West Bank. Last year, the UN General Assembly asked the International Court of Justice to give that advisory opinion after Israel effectively banned the UN Agency for Palestinian Refugees, the main provider of aid to Gaza, from operating in the territory. Well, we're going to talk more about the humanitarian situation in Gaza now with former CNN correspondent Arwa Damon, who's also the founder of INARA, a nonprofit currently providing medical and mental health care to children in Gaza. Arwa, thank you so much for taking the time to speak to us.
Thank you for having me.
Let's start with this decision today from the ICJ. Are you hopeful at all about that decision that's due to come out today? And practically speaking, would it change anything on the ground?
I mean, in theory, it should, but realistically speaking, probably not. The only real player who can change anything on the ground and put adequate pressure on Israel to allow insufficient levels of aid is the United States. And unless the Trump administration is willing to do that, tragically, the people of Gaza are going to continue to suffer under these continuous horrendous conditions. Yes, on the one hand, are there more trucks entering now than there were prior to the ceasefire? Yes, but we have to keep in mind that that's a very low baseline. It's close to zero. And we do have aid trucks coming in, but not in sufficient quantities. We don't have enough shelter items. We don't have enough food items. And what is getting through on the commercial market, for example, is a positive indication, but the prices remain astronomical. And I'll just give you one example. Our program coordinator, Yusra, was able to buy chicken shawarma, so a chicken wrap for her kids for the first time in 7 months, but each wrap cost $21. And so obviously these prices are unrealistic for the population. And you can see the images of desolation there. I mean, just try to imagine what it would take to survive in a landscape like that. It would take everything. And we still are unable to provide to the Palestinian population of Gaza everything it is that they need.
Ara, you mentioned earlier this pressure that you think should come from the United States. Today, we are seeing the U.S. Vice President J.D. Vance, who is in Israel. The Secretary of State, Marco Rubio, is scheduled to go tomorrow. Do you feel that the U.S. is stepping up this pressure as required that could indeed, in turn, help the people of Gaza?
I mean, it has stepped it up in the sense that, it was the Trump administration, no matter how it is that you feel about him and his policies, that did manage to ultimately push this deal through. And on the one hand, there does appear to be a level of understanding among administration officials that aid is needed into Gaza. But what happens behind closed doors, what sort of statements the Israelis continue to make about why it is that they're not upping the levels of trucks that are going in, about why it is that they're not allowing humanitarian organizations to use all of the crossings, that we are not privy to at this stage. But what we do know is that we are far, far below the agreed upon and required lowest number of trucks for Gaza, and that is 600. 600 at least is what we need. And we also need all of the crossings into Gaza to be opened. And then there's another factor to also take into consideration. Gaza needs heavy machinery, not just to clear rubble to be able to access the bodies of the hostages who remain, but also the nearly 10,000 bodies of Palestinians who are missing, believed to be buried under the rubble, but also to clear roads and avenues so that aid can move with greater ease within the Gaza Strip. And so it's not just a matter of, flicking a switch and saying, hey, Gaza's going to get flooded with aid. There's a lot that actually needs to happen alongside that. And right now, we're really not seeing a strong enough effort to make that a reality.
And in addition to all of that concrete, practical aid that is so desperately needed, I mean, you have to factor in as well the psychological damage that this has caused over the past 2 years for everyone in the Gaza Strip. What are your teams seeing on the ground in regard to psychological effects of all of this trauma and what's being done to help?
It's enormous. It really eclipses, any rhetoric that I think anyone has at this stage. We do a lot of work with children, and you hear children as they're being driven around the Gaza Strip or having to ride a donkey cart around the Gaza Strip or having to carry canisters of water heavier than they are, talk about things that no child ever should. They have experienced levels of fear that are extraordinarily difficult to overcome. They have had every single so-called pillar of stability in their life completely taken away from them. And that is going to have a long-lasting, severely debilitating impact on their ability to move forward in life, unless, of course, we are able to provide them with the mental health and psychological support that they need. But you have, children who have witnessed in front of them complete and total horrors. I remember on my first trip into Gaza, over a year ago, I met a mother who came over and was absolutely beside herself because her little boy, who was 7 years old, she was saying, was rocking back and forth every single night, pulling his hair out and shrieking. And he was doing this because he had witnessed his little sister's head pop off because of the impact and pressure from an explosion. These are the things that children have been tragically, horrifically subjected to. And there is no sign of real childhood right now in Gaza. Yes, we and other organizations are trying to do the best that we can to set up makeshift education centers, to run these mental health and psychosocial activities, to give children the tools to cope. But you have to take into consideration that every single child in Gaza is suffering from severe and very deep and intense trauma. And despite all of our efforts, given, and this goes hand in hand with the lack of sufficient aid and stability, the vast majority of children still have to spend their days waiting in line for water, trying to help their parents clear rubble, scrounging through trash, looking for bits and pieces that can be used as a shelter or maybe, resold twisted chunks of metal. And so restoring stability and a semblance of something that can at the very least appear to be, a childhood is something that is very vital moving forward. And one last point on that too, we need to talk about what the impact of sustained malnutrition is on a child's body. We had a deliberate starvation campaign of Gaza that lasted for months. One bout of malnutrition for a child under the age of 5 can cause long-term organ and brain development challenges. And so you also have this that the population there is facing, which again is another reason why we're all pressing for even more aid to get into Gaza so that we can begin to address and hopefully reverse some of the impacts of what has happened over the last 2 years.
Arwa, thank you for sharing all of that with us. Arwa Damon, the founder of INARA, the International Network for Aid, Relief, and Assistance, speaking to me live there from Istanbul. Thanks so much.